1917 was the year when the Russian Tsar was deposed and his empire began dissolving. It was then, 100 years ago, that Ukraine saw its first life as a modern nation-state. The Russian Revolution of February 1917 brought into power the Provisional Government, which promptly introduced freedom of speech and assembly and lifted the tsarist restrictions on minorities. It was meant to be a temporary body that would govern Russia in place of the Tsar until elections could be held. In March 1917, on the initiative of these new organizations, the Central Rada was formed in Kyiv as a Ukrainian representative body. In April, the more broadly convened All-Ukrainian National Congress declared the Central Rada to be the highest national authority in Ukraine and elected the historian Mykhaylo Hrushevsky at its head. The stated goal of the Central Rada was territorial autonomy for Ukraine and the transformation of Russia into a democratic federative republic. Although the Provisional Government recognized Ukraine's right for autonomy and the Central Rada as a legitimate representative body, there were unsolved disputes over its territorial jurisdiction and political prerogatives. Locally, especially in the Russified cities of eastern Ukraine, the Rada also had to compete with the increasingly radical Soviets of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, whose support in the Ukrainian population, however, was quite limited. Ukrainian-Russian relations deteriorated rapidly following the Bolshevik coup in Petrograd on November 7, 1917. The Central Rada refused to accept the new regime's authority over Ukraine and on November 20th proclaimed the creation of the Ukrainian National Republic, though still in federation with the new democratic Russia that was expected to emerge from the impending Constituent Assembly. On December 17, 1917, the Petrograd-based Council of People's Commissars issued an ultimatum demanding that Bolshevik troops be granted the legal right to be stationed on Ukrainian soil. Also, the Bolsheviks proclaimed their own Ukrainian government based in Kharkiv on 25 December, and then proceeded with a campaign to establish effective military control over Ukraine. The Ukrainian forces at that time consisted of a small volunteer detachment and several battalions of the Free Cossacks. The pro-Soviet forces in Ukraine included Russian army regulars stationed at the front, several garrisoned units, and Red Guard detachments composed of laborers from Kharkiv gubernia and the Donbass. Their main strength, however, laid in a large force of Red Guards from Russia, which had been stationed along the Ukrainian border. On 25 December, a 30,000-strong army, led by Vladimir Anatov Ovsienko, set off in 4 groups from Homel and Bryansk towards Chernihiv-Bakhmuk region, Lviv-Konotop region, and Kharkiv, Poltava, and Lozova region. The Central Rada prepared for the defense of the capital by sending advance forces of volunteers to Poltava and Bakhmuk. As the Soviet advance continued, an attempt was made to take Kyiv through an uprising organized by non-Ukrainian workers based at the Arsenal plant. Fighting broke out on the 29th of January 1918 and continued until the 4th February, when the revolt was put down. Meanwhile, the Bolshevik Expeditionary Force continued to move on the capital. On February 8th, the Ukrainian government was forced to evacuate the city. On February 9th, Ukraine and the Central Powers signed the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Almost immediately, however, the government had to evacuate to the right bank, as Soviet troops under Mikhail Hrushevsky's command entered Kyiv on the same day, and then carried out brutal reprisals against the Ukrainian civilian population. After taking Kyiv, the Bolsheviks launched an offensive in right bank Ukraine, where they were engaged in battle mainly with Free Cossack forces and forced the Ukrainians back to a Zhytomyr-Korostin-Sarny defensive line. On 18th February, the German and Austro-Hungarian forces started a major offensive against the Soviets with 53 divisions. Central Powers' armies had advanced over 240 kilometers within a week, facing no serious Soviet resistance. With the Ukrainian command of General Konstantin Przovsky and Simon Petliura, the combined force rolled the Bolshevik troops right out of right bank Ukraine's centers and regained Kyiv on March 1st. The rapid German-Austrian advance forced the Soviets to sign on March 3, 1918, the peace treaty of Brest-Litovsk, ending Russian participation in World War I. On 29 April 1918, the authority of the Ukrainian People's Republic was suspended, having been overthrown by the pro-German Ukrainian state of Pavlo Skoropadsky, who was elected as a hetman by a Congress of Peasants. After the armistice of 11th November 1918 that ended World War I, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk between the Bolshevik government of Russia and the Central Powers was annulled by the Bolshevik legislature on 13th November 1918. The second phase of the Ukrainian-Soviet War began with the fall of the German-supported government of Pavlo Skoropadsky on December 14th to the forces of the Directory of the Ukrainian National Republic. The Bolsheviks took advantage of the unsettled situation by forming a Provisional Workers' and Peasants' Government of Ukraine on 20th November 1918 and started a military advance into Ukraine with an army led by Vladimir Anatov Ovsienko, Joseph Stalin, and Vladimir Zatonsky. The Directory protested the aggression, with diplomatic notes sent to the Soviet government on 31st December 1918 and on the 3rd, 4th, and 9th January 1919. Not having received a reply, the Directory was compelled to declare war against Russia on January 16th. The Ukrainian forces at that time consisted of two regular troop formations, the Zaporozhian Corps and the Sich Riflemen. In December 1918 and January 1919, the Bolshevik Expeditionary Force captured left bank Ukraine, and on 5th February, it closed in on Kyiv, where it forced the Ukrainian government once more to flee from the capital. The UNR army's fortunes improved as Ukrainian peasants, disgruntled by the Bolsheviks' anti-Ukrainian policy and high requisition quotas, started to replenish insurgent ranks. But before the army itself could regroup, it faced an assault by Polish forces in the Lutsk region and advances from the Red Army in the north and southeast. As the Bolsheviks retreated yet again, Petliura's Ukrainian forces and General Anton Denikin's White Regiments both entered Kyiv on August 31st, though the Ukrainians soon withdrew to avoid overt hostilities. In December, Petliura went to Warsaw to seek outside support. At the same time, the Bolsheviks were beating back Denikin's forces, and on December 16th, they recaptured Kyiv. By February 1920, the Whites had been expelled from Ukrainian territory. Petliura's negotiations with the Polish government of Józef Piłsudski culminated in the Treaty of Warsaw. The treaty was signed on 21st April 1920, with a military addendum on 24th April. By the terms of the agreement, in return for Polish military aid, Petliura surrendered Ukraine's claim to Galicia and Western Volhynia. A Polish-Ukrainian campaign opened 2 days later, and on May 6th, the joint forces occupied Kyiv. However, a counteroffensive mounted by the Bolsheviks brought them to the outskirts of Warsaw in August. The tides of war turned again as the Polish and Ukrainian armies drove back the Soviets and re-entered the right bank. In October, however, Poland made a truce with the Soviets, and on March 18, 1921, the Polish and Soviet sides signed the Treaty of Riga. The final military action of the UNR against the Soviets was a raid in November 1921, known as the Second Winter Campaign. The intent of the action was to provide a catalyst for the formation of partisan groups, which would incite a general uprising against the Bolsheviks in Ukraine. The commander of the action was Yuri Titunik. 2 expeditionary forces were established, Podolia, 400 men strong, and Volhynia, 800 men strong. Of the 443 soldiers captured by the Soviets, 359 were shot, and 84 were passed on to Soviet security forces. The Second Winter Campaign brought the Ukraine-Soviet War to a definitive conclusion. The partisan movement in Ukraine remained active until mid-1922. The end of the war saw the incorporation of most of the territories of Ukraine into the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic, which on December 30, 1922, was one of the founding members of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. The UNR government, led by Simon Petliura, was forced into exile. For the next few years, the Ukrainian nationalists would continue to try to wage a partisan guerrilla war on the Soviets. They were aided by Polish intelligence. However, they were not successful. The last active Ukrainian movements would be mostly eradicated during the Holodomor, also known as the Terror Famine or the Great Famine, that killed millions of Ukrainians between 1932 and 1933.